Do you know what it means when a doctor tells desperate parents that their disabled child will receive better care, cleaner rooms, more attention, actual supervision, but only if they sign a consent form they don't fully understand, not for treatment, not for therapy, for infection, deliberate infection, with a liver-destroying virus, all in the name of science. Before I tell you what a hidden camera found inside those walls in 1972, I need you to understand something. This isn't about one rogue doctor or one terrible institution. This is about a system, a network of hospitals, universities, and government officials who knew exactly what was happening and chose progress over humanity, children over conscience, data over dignity. What you're about to hear will change how you think about medical research, about informed consent, about the phrase, "for the greater good," because in 1950s America, while families celebrated suburban dreams and scientific advancement, thousands of children were being used as human test subjects behind locked doors, their bodies turned into laboratories, their suffering converted into publishable research, their voices silenced beneath the weight of medical ambition. And the most disturbing part, the doctors who did this never went to prison. Many received awards. Some are still celebrated in medical textbooks today. This is the story of Willowbrook State School. And before we're done, you'll understand why its name became synonymous with one of the darkest chapters in American medical history. The year is 1972, January. A cold Wednesday afternoon in Staten Island, New York. A young journalist named Geraldo Rivera stands outside a sprawling complex of red brick buildings, his hands trembling slightly as he checks the hidden camera concealed beneath his coat. He's been tipped off by a physician who could no longer live with what he'd witnessed inside. The arrangements were made in whispers. A borrowed key, a side entrance rarely monitored, a narrow window of time before anyone would notice. Rivera doesn't know yet that what he's about to record will end his career as a local reporter and launch him into national recognition. He doesn't know that the footage will spark federal investigations, landmark lawsuits, and a complete reimagining of disability rights in America. All he knows is that something terrible is happening behind these walls. Something the state of New York has worked very hard to keep hidden. He slips through the door. The smell hits him first, not the antiseptic scent of a hospital or the chalk dust of a school. Something else entirely. Urine, feces, disinfectant failing to mask decay. The hallway stretches before him, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, institutional green paint peeling from the walls. He can hear it now, a sound like nothing he's ever encountered. Not quite crying, not quite screaming, a constant low murmur of human suffering, echoing through corridors designed to contain it. He turns the corner into the first ward, and what he sees through that viewfinder will haunt him for the rest of his life. The room is massive, designed perhaps for 30 children. It holds well over 100. Most are on the floor, some naked, others in torn, stained clothing that might have been changed days ago, or might not have been changed at all. A boy rocks back and forth in the corner, his motion so constant it seems mechanical. A girl sits motionless near a radiator, her eyes vacant, a pool of urine spreading slowly across the concrete beneath her. Another child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, lies on a thin mattress, his body covered in sores, flies circling lazily above him. The camera captures it all, the neglect so profound it looks almost intentional, the overcrowding so severe that movement between bodies becomes a navigation exercise. And in the far corner, a nurse, one single nurse, attempting to feed a child while dozens of others wait, crying or silent, their needs infinite and unmet. This is Willowbrook State School, the largest institution for disabled children in the United States, the pride of New York's mental health system, a place that on paper promises education, medical care, and dignity. A place that, in reality, has become something else entirely, a warehouse, a dumping ground, and, as Rivera will soon discover, a laboratory where some of the most disturbing medical experiments in American history have been conducted with the blessing of prestigious universities and the silent approval of the state. But to understand how this happened, we need to go back to the years after World War II, when America was building its future and deciding which of its children deserved to be part of it. The war ended in 1945 with ticker tape parades and a surge of national pride. Soldiers returned home to a country flush with optimism. Suburbs exploded outward from city centers. Families grew. The baby boom began. By 1947, hospitals were overflowing with births. Schools were being built at record pace. America was young again, full of promise and possibility. But not every child fit the image of this bright, new future. For families whose sons or daughters were born with intellectual disabilities, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, or severe developmental delays, the message from doctors was clear and consistent. Your child will never learn, never become independent, never live a normal life. The kindest thing you can do is to place them in an institution where professionals can care for them. The word institution carried weight then. It suggested structure, expertise, medical oversight. It promised relief for overwhelmed families and specialized care for children who needed it. What it actually meant in practice was removal, permanent separation, a kind of social disappearance. Willowbrook was built to embody that promise. Constructed in the late 1940s on the northern edge of Staten Island, it sprawled across hundreds of acres. Red brick buildings arranged in neat rows, lawns that from the outside looked almost collegiate. Politicians posed for photographs at the ribbon cutting, declaring it a triumph of modern social policy. It was designed to house 4,000 children, a staggering number, but officials assured the public it was necessary, efficient, progressive. What they didn't say was that even from the beginning, the math didn't work. 4,000 beds for a state with tens of thousands of families desperate for placement. Waiting lists grew immediately. Administrators, pressure to accept more children, began allowing overcrowding. Rooms designed for 20 held 40, then 50. By the mid-1950s, enrollment exceeded 6,000. Hallways became dormitories. Bathrooms became shared spaces for hundreds. The ratio of staff to children collapsed under the weight of impossible numbers. Inside, the reality was far from the promises made to desperate parents. Food was stretched thin, clothing was rationed, often shared. Children wandered hallways unsupervised for hours. Toilets overflowed. Diseases spread like wildfire through the crowded wards, particularly one illness that seemed impossible to contain: hepatitis. The virus attacked the liver, turning eyes yellow, swelling bellies, leaving children weak and feverish. In most places, an outbreak would trigger quarantine measures, panic intervention. At Willowbrook, it became routine, almost expected. Nurses learned to spot it instantly. Administrators stopped reporting every case. It was simply part of life there, background noise in an institution already drowning in neglect. To some doctors, this presented not a crisis, but an opportunity. If hepatitis was already rampant, if children were going to get sick anyway, why not study it? Why not take control of the infection, observe it carefully, and extract knowledge that might one day save lives beyond these walls? It was a thought that should have stopped at the ethical line. But in 1950s America, that line was blurry at best. The Nuremberg trials had condemned Nazi medical atrocities only years earlier, but their lessons hadn't yet reshaped American medicine. Vulnerable populations, prisoners, The mentally ill, the disabled, were still seen as acceptable research subjects. And at Willowbrook, one doctor was about to turn that logic into a research program that would span 15 years. His name was Dr. Saul Krugman, and what he was about to do would make Willowbrook infamous forever. Krugman wasn't a villain in the traditional sense. He didn't look like one. He was a respected pediatrician affiliated with New York University, published, admired, ambitious. When he first toured Willowbrook in the mid-1950s and saw the scale of hepatitis infection, he didn't see tragedy, he saw possibility. Here was a captive population, children who were already exposed to the virus, an environment where infection rates were so high that studying transmission patterns would be simple. To Krugman, the conditions were appalling for care, but perfect for research, and so he proposed something extraordinary: a series of controlled experiments where newly admitted children would be deliberately infected with hepatitis, their symptoms carefully documented, their blood drawn repeatedly, their illness monitored, from infection to recovery. He believed this would answer crucial questions. How did hepatitis spread? Were there multiple strains? How did immunity develop? Could a vaccine be created? To Krugman, these questions justified the means. The children, he reasoned, were going to get sick anyway. By controlling the infection, he could transform their inevitable suffering into scientific progress. To gain access, he needed parental consent, or something that resembled it. Parents were told their children would likely contract hepatitis simply by living at Willowbrook. That was true enough. But then came the offer. If they agreed to let their child participate in the study, that child would be moved to a newer, cleaner ward with better staff ratios and more supervision, in a facility where the general population lived in squalor. This sounded like salvation. Many parents, desperate and overwhelmed, agreed. Some may not have fully understood what they were signing. Others felt they had no real choice. The alternative was leaving their child in the disease-ridden chaos of the main wards. Consent became less an act of free will than a transaction born of fear. The experiments began quietly. New admissions were brought to special research units. Their baseline health was documented, blood was drawn, and then the infection was administered, sometimes mixed into chocolate milkshakes, sometimes into oatmeal. The children ate, unsuspecting. Within weeks, symptoms emerged. Fever spiked, skin turned yellow, stomachs swelled, vomiting became constant. Some children thrashed in confusion. Others grew lethargic, retreating into silence. Every symptom was recorded with clinical precision: temperature, jaundice severity, appetite changes. Blood samples were analyzed for antibodies. Stool samples examined under microscopes. For the doctors, this was groundbreaking research. For the children, it was bewildering, painful, and terrifying. The studies expanded over the years. More children were enrolled. The data accumulated, and in medical journals, the findings were celebrated. Krugman and his colleagues published papers that helped distinguish between hepatitis A and hepatitis G, advancing the understanding of viral transmission and immunity. Some in the medical community called it pioneering work. Few questioned the morality of deliberately infecting disabled children who could not consent. And here's what makes this truly chilling. Within Willowbrook, the experiments blended seamlessly into the institution's grim routine. Children continued to fall ill, whether part of the study or not. Staff carried on with impossible workloads. Administrators quietly supported the research, seeing in it both prestige and justification for the school's existence. The children themselves remained voiceless, their suffering converted into tables and charts, their humanity buried beneath scientific ambition. But something was about to change, not because of institutional oversight, not because of medical ethics committees, but because one journalist refused to look away. When Geraldo Rivera's footage aired in early 1972, the response was immediate and explosive. Millions of Americans watched from their living rooms as the camera revealed what had been hidden for decades. Children lying in their own waste, overcrowded rooms that looked more like prisons than schools. The stench of neglect, made visible through images that no amount of official language could explain away. The broadcast was titled Willowbrook, The Last Disgrace. Rivera's narration was blunt, almost angry. He didn't soften the reality. He showed the filth, the abandonment, the complete absence of care. He called it what it was: a disgrace, a violation of every principle of decency. The public reaction was immediate. Letters poured into television stations. Phone calls flooded government offices. Families who had trusted the state with their children demanded answers. Politicians, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. Investigations were announced. Hearings were scheduled. For the first time in Willowbrook's history, its operations were exposed to full public scrutiny. But Rivera's report revealed something else. The overcrowding and neglect were only part of the story. As journalists dug deeper, Details of the hepatitis experiments began to surface, and when the public learned that children had been deliberately infected with a dangerous virus, the outrage intensified. The justifications that had satisfied medical journals suddenly sounded hollow. The argument that children would have gotten sick anyway seemed like rationalization. The promise of scientific advancement felt like a mask for exploitation, and the consent forms parents had signed looked less like genuine agreement and more like coercion. The question everyone began asking was simple. How could this have happened? How could doctors deliberately infect children? How could universities approve such research? How could the state allow it to continue for 15 years? The answer was uncomfortable. It happened because the children of Willowbrook were invisible, because society had already decided their lives were worth less, because medical ambition was allowed to override ethical restraint, and because silence, maintained by institutions and accepted by the public, had protected the system for far too long. Hearings began within weeks of Rivera's broadcast. Parents testified, their voices breaking as they described visits to their children. Former staff members spoke of impossible conditions, of being told to stay quiet, of watching neglect become policy, and slowly, the full scope of the hepatitis experiments came into focus. Dr. Krugman was called to testify. He defended his work calmly, repeating the arguments he'd made for years. The children were going to get hepatitis anyway. The research was necessary. The studies had advanced medical knowledge and contributed to the eventual development of vaccines. To him, the ends justified the means, but in the courtroom, with photographs of sick children projected on screens behind him, those arguments rang hollow. What had seemed reasonable in medical conferences now looked like exploitation. What had been framed as scientific progress now appeared as systematic abuse. The legal battles that followed were groundbreaking. Civil rights lawyers argued that Willowbrook's residents had been denied their constitutional rights, that the conditions amounted to cruel and unusual punishment, that disabled children deserved the same protections as any other citizen. It was a radical argument. At the time, disability rights were barely recognized, but the evidence was overwhelming. In 1975, a landmark settlement was reached. The Willowbrook Consent Decree. The state of New York agreed to improve conditions immediately and to move toward closing the institution entirely. It was a victory, but a slow one. Implementation took years. Overcrowding persisted. Reform moved at the pace of bureaucracy, while children continued to suffer. Still, the decree marked a turning point. For the first time, the rights of disabled individuals were enshrined in a legal agreement, and the precedents set at Willowbrook would ripple outward, influencing disability rights law across the nation. But for many residents, reform came too late. Years of neglect had left permanent scars. Some never adjusted to life outside. Others carried trauma that no amount of community care could heal. And for the families, guilt and anger remained. Guilt for placing their children there. Anger at a system that had betrayed their trust. By 1987, Willowbrook officially closed. The sprawling campus fell silent. Some buildings were repurposed, others were left abandoned, their empty halls echoing with decades of suffering. For survivors, the closure brought mixed emotions: relief that the nightmare was over, sorrow for the years that could never be recovered. The legacy of Willowbrook extends far beyond its walls. It became a catalyst for the disability rights movement, proof that institutions were fundamentally flawed. It influenced the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. It reshaped medical ethics, making Willowbrook a case study in what never to do again. In medical schools today, students learn about the hepatitis experiments not as triumphs of science, but as warnings. The phrase informed consent carries the weight of Willowbrook's failures, and every discussion of human subjects research is haunted by the question: are we protecting the vulnerable, or are we exploiting them? For the broader public, Willowbrook became a moral touchstone. The phrase "another Willowbrook" entered the vocabulary of advocacy, a warning invoked whenever new scandals emerged in nursing homes, detention centers, or hospitals. It became shorthand for systemic failure, a reminder that neglect can wear many masks. The campus still exists, transformed now into part of a college. Its buildings have been repurposed, its wards emptied, but those who walk its grounds speak of a lingering weight. Survivors who return see past the fresh paint to the memories embedded in the bricks. Nights of fever, days of silence, years of waiting. In the end, Willowbrook's story is not just about one institution. It's about what happens when society decides certain lives matter less, when medical ambition overrides moral restraint, when silence becomes complicity. The children of Willowbrook paid the price for knowledge that should never have been purchased. Their story demands vigilance. It demands that we ask, in every generation, who is invisible now? Who suffers behind closed doors? Who will be our Willowbrook if we choose not to see? The gates of Willowbrook are closed, The experiments have ended. The institution has been dismantled, but the question it leaves behind remains unanswered. Have we truly learned, or are we simply better at hiding the places where the vulnerable still suffer in silence? If this story shocked you, if it made you question how such horrors could exist in plain sight, then you need to see what's coming next. Click the video on your screen right now. I believe it was made for you.